The Arizona Territory, 1878. The desert stretched farther than the eye could see, its endless waves of red sand and weathered stone glowing beneath the relentless afternoon sun. Heat shimmered above the earth, turning distant mountains into wavering shadows. The wind carried dust across the barren landscape, whispering through towering saguaro cacti and jagged cliffs that had stood untouched for centuries. To most travelers, this was a land of danger, a place where water was scarce, the sun showed no mercy, and a single wrong turn could become a death sentence. 22-year-old Eleanor Whitmore had never imagined she would find herself alone in such a place. Only 3 days earlier, she had been riding in a well-appointed carriage toward Tucson, where her father had arranged her marriage to the wealthy son of a prominent ranching family. The marriage promised security, influence, and respectability. It was everything society expected from a young woman of her standing. It was also everything Eleanor dreaded. Her future had been decided long before anyone asked what she wanted. Since childhood, she had been taught that obedience mattered more than dreams. Her mother had reminded her that a respectable woman accepted her duties without complaint. Her father rarely asked for her opinion, believing it unnecessary. Every conversation about her future sounded less like a discussion and more like a business agreement. But Eleanor carried a restless spirit that refused to disappear. She loved books describing distant places, maps filled with unexplored trails, and stories of people who chose their own destinies. Secretly, she dreamed of seeing the vast western frontier with her own eyes instead of reading about it from behind the walls of her family's estate. The arranged marriage would end those dreams forever. So, before dawn on the second day of the journey, Eleanor made the most reckless decision of her life. While the rest of the caravan slept, she quietly packed a small satchel with a canteen, a blanket, a loaf of bread, and a small silver locket that had belonged to her late grandmother. Without leaving a note, she slipped away into the darkness, believing she could reach a nearby trading settlement marked on an old map she had secretly copied weeks before. She underestimated the desert. The map was outdated. Several trails had vanished beneath shifting sand, and landmarks she expected to find simply were not there. Her canteen emptied faster than she anticipated beneath the scorching sun. By the third afternoon, exhaustion weighed upon every step. Still, Eleanor refused to surrender. "If I turn back now," she whispered to herself, "my life will never belong to me." Hours later, her strength finally gave way. She stumbled across a dry wash and collapsed beside a cluster of sun-bleached rocks. Her throat burned with thirst. Every breath felt heavier than the last. The endless silence surrounded her until even the wind seemed to disappear. Then came the sound. A horse. At first she believed she was imagining it. The rhythmic hoofbeats grew louder, echoing softly through the canyon walls. Summoning what little strength remained, Eleanor forced herself to look up. A rider emerged from the shimmering horizon. He sat tall upon a powerful chestnut horse, moving with effortless confidence across the unforgiving terrain. His clothing blended naturally with the desert, practical rather than decorative, and a bow rested securely across his back. His calm posture suggested someone who belonged to this land instead of merely surviving within it. The rider slowed as he noticed the lone woman lying among the rocks. He did not immediately approach. Instead, he observed. Years of experience had taught him that the desert often concealed danger behind appearances. A helpless traveler could be genuine, or bait for an ambush. Every movement deserved careful consideration. The man was known among his people as Taza, a respected Apache scout whose responsibility was to watch the boundaries of his homeland. He knew every canyon, every spring, every hidden trail scattered across the mountains. More importantly, he understood that strangers often brought conflict. He guided his horse in a cautious circle around Eleanor, studying the abandoned footprints leading into the valley. There were no soldiers. No wagons. No signs of pursuit. Only one frightened woman. Eleanor slowly lifted trembling hands. I'm not armed," she managed to say, though her cracked voice barely carried across the hot air. Taza remained silent. He could see exhaustion in her eyes, sunburn across her face, and dust-covering clothes clearly made for Eastern society rather than desert travel. Nothing about her suggested she belonged here. She looked more lost than dangerous. For several long moments neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Taza finally dismounted. He approached carefully, never lowering his guard completely. Kneeling several feet away, he removed a small leather water pouch from his saddle. Instead of handing it directly to her, he placed it gently upon the ground between them and stepped back. The choice was hers. Eleanor stared at the pouch before reaching for it with shaking hands. She drank slowly, remembering stories warning travelers not to waste precious water. Even those few careful sips brought life back into her tired body. When she looked up again, gratitude filled her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Although they did not yet share the same language fluently, kindness required no translation. Taza knew that leaving her alone would almost certainly mean death before another sunrise. Yet bringing a stranger into Apache territory carried risks of its own. His people had endured years of violence, broken promises, and suspicion from outsiders. Trust was not freely given. As the sun began sinking behind the distant mesas, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Taza faced a choice that would change both of their lives. After one final glance toward the empty horizon, he quietly motioned for Eleanor to follow. With unsteady legs and a heart filled with uncertainty, she rose to her feet. Neither of them could know that this single decision, one act of compassion in the middle of an unforgiving desert, would become the beginning of a story neither had ever imagined. The journey into the mountains began as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the desert mesas. Eleanor followed several paces behind Taza, struggling to match the steady pace of his horse. Though he occasionally glanced back to ensure she had not fallen behind, he spoke little. The silence between them was not unfriendly, it was cautious. They were strangers from worlds that had spent years fearing one another. The narrow trail wound through rocky canyons and hidden valleys that Eleanor would never have found on her own. Towering cliffs shielded them from the open desert, while clusters of juniper and cottonwood trees hinted at precious sources of water nearby. Every turn revealed a landscape more beautiful than the last, untouched by the settlements she had known. After nearly 2 hours, Taza raised his hand, signaling her to stop. Ahead, tucked between towering cliffs, was a small Apache camp. Several traditional wickiups stood beneath the shade of cottonwood trees, and a narrow stream flowed quietly through the valley. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and children laughed as they played beside the water. The laughter stopped the moment Eleanor stepped into view. Every face turned toward the stranger. Women gathered their children closer. Warriors instinctively rested their hands near their weapons. Curious whispers spread through the camp as everyone looked from Eleanor to Taza, silently asking the same question. Why had he brought her here? An elderly man with silver-streaked hair approached slowly. Though age had bent his shoulders slightly, his sharp eyes revealed years of wisdom and leadership. He exchanged several quiet words with Taza in Apache. Eleanor couldn't understand their conversation, but she recognized the tension in their expressions. The elder studied her carefully. She lowered her eyes respectfully, unsure whether speaking would help or make matters worse. After a long silence, the elder gave a slow nod. Taza turned toward Eleanor. "You stay," he said in careful English. It was only 2 words, but they carried enormous relief. A middle-aged woman named Ayana stepped forward with a kind but cautious smile. She offered Eleanor a wooden bowl filled with warm stew made from beans, squash, and venison. Eleanor accepted it with both hands. "Thank you," she said softly. Ayana did not understand every word, but gratitude was easy to recognize. She smiled gently before motioning for Eleanor to sit beside the evening fire. That night, Eleanor slept beneath a woven blanket inside a small shelter. It was far simpler than the large bedroom she had left behind, yet for the first time in many days, she felt safe. The following morning began before sunrise. The camp came alive with quiet purpose. Hunters prepared for the day's journey, women gathered herbs and firewood, while children helped carry water from the stream. Everyone had responsibilities, and each task was treated as equally important. Eleanor watched with fascination. No one ordered others about. No one seemed above another. Instead, every person contributed according to their abilities. Ayanna noticed Eleanor observing and handed her a small basket. With patient gestures and a few simple English words, she invited Eleanor to gather edible plants nearby. Though awkward at first, Eleanor eagerly helped. She learned how certain desert flowers could be used for medicine and which berries were safe to eat. Every mistake became a lesson rather than an embarrassment. Over the following days, language slowly became less of a barrier. Taza knew a handful of English words from encounters with traders, while Eleanor began learning simple Apache greetings and names for local plants and animals. Their conversations were brief but meaningful. One afternoon, while repairing a broken water container near the stream, Eleanor looked toward the surrounding cliffs. "You know this land better than anyone," she said. Taza smiled faintly. "The land teaches," he replied. She considered his words. "Where I come from, people try to own the land." Taza gently shook his head. "No one owns the earth." The simple sentence stayed with Eleanor long after the conversation ended. As the weeks passed, trust slowly replaced fear. Taza showed her how to recognize animal tracks in the sand and how to locate hidden springs between rocky outcrops. He taught her to move quietly through the desert, listening to birds whose calls often warned of approaching strangers. In return, Eleanor shared stories of the cities she had known, brick buildings taller than cottonwood trees, trains that crossed hundreds of miles in days, and libraries filled with thousands of books. Both realized how little they truly understood about the other's world. Yet not everyone welcomed Eleanor's presence. Several younger warriors questioned Taza's judgment. "She is one of them," one argued during an evening council. "Today she is harmless. Tomorrow soldiers may follow." Others silently agreed. Even among the women, whispers spread through the camp. Why had Taza risked bringing an outsider into their home? Taza never argued loudly. Instead, he simply answered, "She came alone. The desert would have taken her." His words ended the discussion, for the moment. One evening, Eleanor sat beside the stream, watching the fading sunlight paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. She realized she no longer counted the days since leaving home. For the first time in her life, no one was deciding her future for her. Across the water, Taza noticed the peaceful smile on her face. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. Yet deep within both of them, something quiet had begun to grow, not born from sudden passion, but from shared respect, kindness, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest distance between two people is not measured in miles, but in the fears they choose to overcome. Neither Eleanor nor Taza realized that their growing friendship had already become the subject of whispers beyond the camp. Far across the desert, settlers searching for the missing young woman had begun to believe she had been taken against her will. Before long, those rumors would bring danger to everyone in the valley. Autumn arrived quietly in the mountains. The scorching days grew shorter, and cool winds drifted through the cottonwood trees that surrounded the Apache camp. Leaves of gold and amber floated across the stream, while the evenings filled with the scent of cedar fires and the distant songs of coyotes beneath a sky crowded with stars. By now, Eleanor no longer felt like a lost traveler. She woke before sunrise with the rest of the camp, helped gather water from the stream, prepared meals alongside Ayanna, and had even learned enough Apache words to hold simple conversations with the children, who laughed whenever she mispronounced a phrase. What had once seemed unfamiliar had slowly become part of her daily life. Still, she never forgot that she was an outsider. Some members of the tribe had come to accept her presence, but others remained cautious. They remembered years of broken treaties, raids, and violence. To them, Eleanor represented the world beyond the mountains, a world that had often brought suffering rather than peace. Taza understood their concerns. He carried the same memories. As a boy, he had watched soldiers ride through villages and force families from lands they had known for generations. He had grown into a scout because protecting his people meant understanding every trail, every canyon, and every sign of approaching danger. Trust was earned slowly. Yet somehow, Eleanor had earned a small piece of it. One afternoon, Taza invited her to accompany him into the hills to gather medicinal plants before winter arrived. The journey took them along narrow ledges overlooking vast valleys painted in shades of red and bronze. Hawks circled high above, riding invisible currents of warm air. Eleanor stopped to admire the view. "I've never seen anything so beautiful," she whispered. Taza looked across the horizon. "When you stop trying to conquer the land," he said, "you begin to see its beauty." She smiled. "You always speak as if the mountains are alive." "They are." She laughed softly. "I think they're beginning to teach me, too." For the first time, Taza laughed with her. The sound surprised them both. It was brief, but genuine. As they continued walking, Eleanor realized she no longer feared the silence between them. It had become comfortable, filled not with uncertainty but with understanding. Later that afternoon, dark clouds gathered unexpectedly over the mountains. A cold rain swept across the canyon, turning dry trails into slippery paths. Thunder echoed through the cliffs as Taza quickly led Eleanor toward a shallow cave hidden beneath an overhanging rock. Inside, they waited while the storm raged outside. Rain poured like silver curtains across the entrance. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "Back home," she said quietly, "everyone had plans for my life." Taza listened. "My father chose the man I was supposed to marry. My future was already decided before anyone asked what I wanted." She looked down at her hands. "I spent years believing my life belonged to everyone except me." Taza remained silent for a moment before answering. "In my people, every path has responsibilities. Sometimes we choose them. Sometimes they choose us. And what about your path?" He stared toward the rain. "My duty is to protect my people. Even if it costs you your own happiness." His eyes met hers. "If my people are safe, the cost is worth paying." His answer carried no bitterness. Only acceptance. The rain gradually softened until only gentle drops fell from the rocks outside. Neither hurried to leave. The quiet cave had become a place where two lives, shaped by different worlds, could finally speak honestly. As evening approached, they began walking back toward the camp beneath a sky glowing with the colors of sunset. When they reached a ridge overlooking the valley, Eleanor stopped. Smoke from the evening fires curled peacefully into the fading light. "This place has become my home," she admitted. Taza looked at her. "You may not always stay." "I know." The words were difficult to say. "If I return," she continued, "people will never believe what I've found here. They'll only believe the stories they've always told." Taza understood. Fear often spoke louder than truth. Days passed. Their friendship continued to deepen, though neither gave voice to the feelings growing quietly between them. They both knew the boundaries that separated their worlds. One evening, after the camp had fallen asleep, Eleanor walked alone to the stream where moonlight shimmered across the water. She heard quiet footsteps behind her. Taza. Neither seemed surprised to find the other there. For a long while, they simply watched the current flow. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said at last. "About what?" "About leaving." The words hung in the cool night air. "I don't know where I belong anymore." Taza looked toward the stars. "Sometimes the heart walks a different path than the feet." She smiled sadly. "That's a beautiful way to say life is complicated." "It is." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves around them. Eleanor turned toward him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," she whispered. I don't know if I'll ever see this place again. Her voice trembled. But before fate decides for us. She stepped closer. Let me feel you once. The request was not driven by desire alone. It was a plea to remember, to hold on to a moment of genuine connection before the uncertainty of tomorrow could take it away. For a heartbeat, Taza stood motionless. He knew what such a moment meant. He also knew the dangers it carried. Then, with quiet tenderness, he opened his arms. Eleanor stepped forward. They embraced beneath the moonlit sky, holding one another as if trying to preserve the fragile peace they had found together. No promises were spoken. No vows were made. Only the silent understanding that some bonds are formed not by words, but by compassion, trust, and the courage to care despite the risks. Far beyond the mountains, however, riders were already following faint tracks through the desert. The rumors had spread. Settlers believed Eleanor had been captured. A rescue party, and a company of soldiers, had begun riding toward Apache territory. Neither Eleanor nor Taza knew that the quiet world they had built was about to be shattered. The first sign of trouble came with the dust. At sunrise, Taza stood on a rocky ridge overlooking the valley, his sharp eyes scanning the distant horizon. A thin cloud of dust drifted across the desert floor, too steady to be caused by the wind. It moved with purpose. Horsemen. He crouched low, studying the trail. There were too many riders to be hunters and too organized to be traders. Whoever they were heading toward the mountains. Without another moment's hesitation, Taza hurried back to the camp. The peaceful morning quickly changed. Children were called away from the stream. Cooking fires were extinguished to reduce the smoke. Warriors quietly gathered their bows, rifles, and horses while elders met beneath the largest cottonwood tree. Eleanor watched the sudden activity with growing concern. "What is happening?" she asked as Taza approached. "They are coming." "Who?" He looked toward the horizon. "Settlers, and soldiers." A chill ran through her despite the warm morning air. "They're looking for me." Taza gave a slow nod. "They believe you were taken." Eleanor lowered her head. She had feared this moment from the day she arrived. "They'll never believe I came here willingly." "No." The single word carried the weight of painful experience. For years, misunderstandings had turned into battles. Rumors had become excuses for violence. Too often, no one had stopped long enough to learn the truth. By midday, the camp's council had gathered. The elderly leader listened as scouts reported the movements of the approaching riders. Nearly 30 men were traveling together, including local ranchers, deputies, and a small group of cavalry soldiers. Some of the younger Apache warriors immediately demanded action. "They enter our land with weapons," one said angrily. "We should stop them before they reach the valley." Another agreed. "They have never come here in peace." Others urged caution, reminding everyone that a fight would bring even more soldiers. The discussion grew heated. Finally, the elder raised his hand. Silence fell. "We will not begin bloodshed," he said calmly. "But we will protect our people." His decision was respected, though not everyone agreed with it. That afternoon, Eleanor sat alone beside the stream, staring at her reflection in the water. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The frightened daughter who had fled an arranged marriage seemed like someone from another lifetime. Footsteps approached behind her. It was Ayanna. Without speaking, the older woman sat beside Eleanor and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I bring danger," Eleanor whispered. Ayanna gently shook her head. Danger was already walking this land. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. "If I had never come. You came because your heart needed freedom." The kindness in Ayanna's voice only deepened Eleanor's sorrow. Nearby, Taza prepared his horse and checked his supplies. Another warrior approached him. "You care for her." It was not a question. Taza remained silent. That silence is your answer. The warrior sighed. Our people see it. I have forgotten nothing about my duty, Taza replied. I know. But duty becomes difficult when the heart chooses another path. The words lingered long after the warrior walked away. As evening approached, another scout returned at full speed. They are closer than we thought. The riders would likely reach the outer valleys by dawn. The elder immediately made his decision. The women, children, and elders will move deeper into the mountains tonight. The camp came alive with quiet urgency. Families packed only what they could carry. Horses were loaded with blankets, food, and tools. No one panicked, but everyone understood the seriousness of the situation. Taza approached Eleanor. You cannot stay here. She looked at him. And if I go with them? They will keep searching. What if I return to the soldiers? He hesitated. They may not believe you. They have to. His expression told her otherwise. Even if the soldiers accepted her story, fear and suspicion might still lead to violence. The presence of armed men in Apache territory had often ended badly, regardless of intentions. The moon had just begun to rise when the camp quietly emptied into the mountains. Only a handful of warriors remained behind to watch the approaching riders. Taza and Eleanor traveled together along a narrow trail hidden between towering cliffs. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. I never wanted anyone to suffer because of me. I know. If giving myself up will keep everyone safe, I'll do it. Taza stopped walking. He turned to face her. You believe they will listen. I have to believe that. He looked into her eyes, seeing both fear and determination. I have seen too many men arrive with fear already in their hearts. Fear does not listen easily. The trail led them to a small overlook where they could see the valley below. In the distance, tiny campfires flickered. The search party had arrived. Eleanor's heart pounded. They're closer than I imagined. So is the danger. At dawn, a small group of soldiers and settlers rode into the abandoned Apache camp. Finding empty shelters and cold fire pits, they became convinced the tribe had fled with their captive. One rancher pointed toward fresh tracks leading into the mountains. They're escaping. Without waiting for orders, several riders spurred their horses forward. The soldiers followed. From high above, hidden among the rocks, Taza watched the riders disappear into the narrow canyon. His face grew grim. They're heading toward the children. For a brief moment, he faced an impossible choice. If he stayed with Eleanor, the fleeing families might be discovered. If he left to warn his people, she would be alone with danger closing in from every direction. Their eyes met. Neither needed to say what both already understood. The time for quiet days beside the stream had ended. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath as Taza made the decision that would change both of their lives forever. The mountain wind howled through the narrow canyon as Taza stood frozen between two impossible choices. Below him, the search party pushed deeper into Apache territory, following fresh hoofprints that would soon lead them toward the families hiding beyond the cliffs. Beside him stood Eleanor, her face pale but determined. She understood the decision before him without a single word being spoken. Go, she said quietly. Taza did not move. If you leave me, they'll find me. They will. And if you stay. He looked toward the distant trail where the riders were disappearing. My people will be in danger. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Eleanor stepped closer and placed her hand gently on his arm. You once saved my life in the desert, she said. Now let me help save yours. A shadow of sadness crossed his face. You owe me nothing. I know. She managed a faint smile. But I owe them. She thought of Ayana's kindness, of the children who had laughed while teaching her new words, of the elders who had slowly accepted her presence despite every reason to fear outsiders. They had offered her shelter without asking for anything in return. She could not allow them to suffer because of her. At last, Taza nodded. I will return. I'll be waiting. Though neither knew if that promise could be kept, they chose to believe it. Without another word, Taza mounted his horse and disappeared into the rugged hills, taking hidden trails only an Apache scout could follow. Eleanor watched until he vanished beyond the rocks. Then she turned and began walking toward the valley below. By midday, the search party spotted her. There, one of the ranchers shouted. The woman. Several riders raced forward, surrounding her before she had taken more than a few steps. A cavalry captain quickly dismounted. Miss Whitmore? Yes. His expression shifted from relief to confusion. Thank heaven you're alive. I was never a prisoner, Eleanor said firmly. The captain frowned. What do you mean? I came here by choice. The ranchers exchanged doubtful glances. She's frightened, one muttered. They've forced her to say that. No, Eleanor replied, raising her voice. No one forced me. The Apache people rescued me when I was dying in the desert. The men looked unconvinced. Another rancher stepped forward. Where are they hiding? I won't tell you. His face hardened. So they've turned you against your own people. They are not my enemies. The argument grew louder. The captain finally raised his hand for silence. Enough. He looked directly at Eleanor. If what you're saying is true, then help us avoid bloodshed. I've been trying. Then tell us where they went. She lowered her eyes. I can't. The captain sighed heavily. I cannot simply turn my men around. We have reports of a kidnapping. And those reports are wrong. Before either could continue, the sharp cry of a hawk echoed through the canyon. Eleanor looked upward. She recognized the signal. Taza. Hidden high among the cliffs, Taza had reached the fleeing families just in time. They're following the lower trail, he warned. The elder immediately ordered everyone to change direction. Women gathered the children while warriors erased footprints with pine branches and guided the horses across rocky ground where no tracks would remain. Within minutes, the entire group had disappeared into a maze of hidden passages known only to the tribe. The search party below would find nothing. Taza allowed himself a quiet breath of relief. His people were safe. Now only one promise remained. As evening approached, tensions in the valley continued to rise. Several impatient ranchers wanted to continue searching through the night. They're close, one insisted. We'll corner them by morning. The cavalry captain hesitated. He had seen no evidence of a captive. Only a determined young woman insisting she had been rescued rather than abducted. His uncertainty grew. Suddenly, hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. Every rifle turned toward the sound. A lone rider emerged from the rocks. Taza. He stopped well beyond the range of immediate capture, remaining calm despite dozens of weapons pointed in his direction. The captain stepped forward cautiously. You speak English? A little. Did your people take this woman? No. Then why was she with you? She was dying. The canyon fell silent. Taza continued. The desert would have taken her before sunset. One rancher shouted angrily. He's lying. Taza ignored him. We gave her water. Another pause. We gave her food. His eyes met the captain's. Nothing more. Eleanor stepped beside the officer. Everything he says is true. The captain studied both of them carefully. There was no fear in Eleanor's eyes. No sign of coercion. Only gratitude. For the first time, doubt settled over the assembled riders. Perhaps the story they had believed was incomplete. One by one, several men slowly lowered their rifles. The rancher who had demanded revenge looked around in frustration. So that's it. We just leave. The captain answered quietly. We came to rescue a captive. He glanced toward Eleanor. There isn't one. The silence that followed felt heavier than any battle. No victory had been won. No enemy had been defeated. Only a misunderstanding had narrowly avoided becoming a tragedy. As the soldiers prepared to leave, Eleanor walked a few steps toward Taza. Neither reached for the other. Too many eyes were watching. I kept my promise, she said softly. So did I. A faint smile appeared between them. It lasted only a moment. The captain approached Eleanor. It's time. She nodded. Turning back toward Taza, she realized there were countless words left unsaid. Instead, she simply whispered. Thank you, for giving me a life that was truly my own. Taza placed his hand over his heart, a quiet gesture of respect. And thank you, he replied, for reminding me that courage can wear many faces. As the search party rode away with Eleanor, she looked back one final time. Taza remained standing upon the ridge, growing smaller with every step the horses carried her away. The mountains soon hid him from sight. Neither knew whether they would ever meet again. But both carried something the desert could never take from them, the certainty that compassion had proven stronger than fear, and that even a forbidden bond could leave a lasting mark on two hearts from different worlds. 5 years passed. The seasons continued their endless journey across the Arizona territory. Spring rains brought life to the valleys, summers painted the desert beneath blazing skies, and autumn winds carried golden leaves through the mountain canyons where Eleanor had once found refuge. Time had changed the land very little, but it had changed the people who had lived through those unforgettable days. Eleanor Whitmore had returned to the world she once called home, but she was no longer the frightened young woman who had fled an arranged marriage. Her father had welcomed her back with relief, though he never fully understood why she refused to marry the man he had chosen. At first, there were arguments, long silences, and disappointed expectations. Yet Eleanor remained firm. My life, she told him one evening, cannot be built upon a choice someone else made for me. For the first time in her life, her father saw not a disobedient daughter, but a determined woman. Though it took time, he accepted her decision. Instead of entering a marriage she did not want, Eleanor devoted herself to teaching. She opened a small school near Tucson where children from ranching families, travelers, and nearby native communities were all welcomed. She believed that fear often came from ignorance, and that understanding began with listening to one another. Her classroom was unlike any other. Maps of the American Southwest covered the walls. Shelves overflowed with books about different cultures, languages, and histories. She encouraged her students to ask questions rather than accept rumors as truth. Sometimes she shared stories of a people who had once saved her life in the desert. She never spoke their location. She never revealed their names. But she always spoke of their kindness. Far away, hidden among the mountains, Taza continued serving his people as a scout. The years had brought many changes. More settlers arrived each season, railroads stretched farther across the frontier, and government officials increasingly sought control over lands the Apache had called home for generations. Challenges remained, but Taza had earned the respect of both the young warriors and the tribal elders. They often sought his advice before making difficult decisions. His experiences had taught him that strength was not measured only by skill in battle. Sometimes the strongest act was choosing peace when conflict seemed easier. One autumn afternoon, a traveling trader stopped at the edge of the Apache territory carrying supplies from Tucson. Among his belongings were several newspapers. Although few in the camp could read English, one article caught Taza's attention after the trader translated it aloud. It described a teacher who had spoken publicly about the importance of understanding native cultures and respecting their traditions. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore. Taza smiled quietly. She had kept her promise. Years later, another opportunity arrived unexpectedly. Representatives from several communities organized a gathering near a trading post to discuss water rights, safe travel routes, and ways to reduce conflict between settlers and native tribes. Both Eleanor and Taza attended. Neither knew the other would be there. As the meeting ended and people slowly dispersed, Eleanor wandered toward the edge of the trading post, where the desert stretched endlessly toward the distant mountains. A familiar voice spoke behind her. "You still watch the horizon." She turned. For a moment, neither moved. Time seemed to disappear. Though a few lines now marked their faces and the years had changed them both, recognition came instantly. "Taza." He smiled. "You remembered. I could never forget." They stood together beneath the fading afternoon sun, surrounded by the quiet sounds of wagons preparing to depart. "So much has changed," Eleanor said. "Yes. And yet, this place still feels the same. The mountains remember." She laughed softly. "You still speak like a poet. And you still ask many questions." They shared a warm laugh, one born not of youthful excitement but of deep respect and cherished memories. They spent the next hour walking through the desert, speaking of everything that had happened since they had parted. Eleanor told him about her school and the children she taught. Taza spoke of the challenges facing his people and the hope that future generations might know fewer wars than those before them. As the sun began to sink below the western horizon, they reached the same overlook where years earlier they had watched the valley below. The wind carried the scent of sage across the rocks. Eleanor looked toward the endless desert. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I had never become lost?" Taza considered the question. "You were not lost." She looked at him with curiosity. "You were finding your path." For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Eleanor stepped closer. "That embrace beneath the moon." She smiled gently. "I have carried it with me every day." "So have I." Their lives had taken different roads. Neither expected the other to abandon family, duty, or purpose. What they had shared belonged to a single moment in time, a moment that had shaped the rest of their lives without demanding they possess one another forever. Before they parted once again, Eleanor extended her hand. Taza looked at it, then gently took it in both of his. No words were needed. It was not the passionate embrace of two young souls facing uncertainty. It was the quiet greeting of two people who had survived, grown, and remained true to themselves. As the first stars appeared above the desert, they walked in opposite directions, one toward the settlement, the other toward the mountains. Neither looked back. They no longer needed to. Their story had become more than a memory. Travelers spoke of the mysterious woman who had crossed the desert and the Apache scout who had chosen compassion over fear. Around campfires, the tale changed with each telling, becoming part history and part legend. Some believed it was only a myth, while others insisted it had truly happened. But those who knew the truth understood the real lesson. The greatest boundaries are rarely rivers, mountains, or deserts. They are the walls built inside human hearts. And when even one person chooses kindness over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and courage over fear, those walls begin to crumble. Long after Eleanor and Taza were gone, children from many backgrounds continued hearing the story of the woman who crossed the desert and the scout who saved her life. It reminded them that history is not shaped only by wars and victories, but also by quiet acts of mercy that echo through generations. For in the end, their forbidden embrace was never remembered because it defied tradition. It was remembered because it proved that compassion has the power to unite people long after fear has faded into history.